Well, thank you for asking me to speak. And the first thing I need to say is, despite my sexy Australian accent, I actually come from Oregon at the moment. And as you can see, in Oregon, we like our mountains. They're on the university seal and they're out there in the wilderness, but we also have a fairly well-established reputation for weirdness. So you can see here, this is the very famous Keep Portland Weird sign, and in front of it is a local celebrity who travels around the city quite regularly. He dresses in a kilt and in a Darth Vader helmet. He rides a unicycle and he plays the Star Wars theme on his flaming bagpipes. And he is by no means the weirdest person you can meet in Portland. So that's the Keep Portland Weird thing. But the other thing I've got to make very clear is that I'm from Oregon and I'm not from Origin, although I was from Origin, so it's kind of complicated. But anyway, we'll move on. Now, I've been given this task of talking about what do we know about the developing youth brain, and is it any clinical use? Was that yours, Pat, that line? It sounded like it came from you. Is it any use? I can just hear Pat saying that when I saw the title. So I'll try and quickly, I've broken the question down into three parts. First of all, what do we know about the developing youth brain? What does it mean? And then, is it any clinical use? Okay, so let's go first. So firstly, just briefly, there's a few things we know about the developing youth brain. The main thing we know is that the brain is developing in the second decade of life quite a lot, and there's a lot happening. It's in fact one of the most dynamic periods of the life for brain development after infancy. And so there's a huge amount happening, and this, you don't need to worry too much about the data here, but this is one of the things that happens, is that the grey matter, the cortex on the outside of the brain, thins across adolescence, and all these graphs here just show you that that's a finding that's been found over and over again in different studies with different samples, so it's a very reliable finding. We're pretty confident about it. And then a second thing that we know about what's happening to the brain during the second decade of life, and there's a picture from one of our studies, and you can see if you look at the right-hand column, if you see all those red and orange bits, they're the parts of the brain that are thinning over this period of life. The other thing that's happening is the brain is connecting up in different ways. And so this is a study of the relationship between different parts of the brain and their activity. And what you need to notice here is that the orange straws are parts of the brain that became more connected, and the green straws are parts of the brain that became less connected as people developed. And what you can see if you look at it is that most of the orange straws are pretty long and most of the green straws are pretty short. And what that means is that the local connections in the brain are reducing and the long-term connections in the brain are increasing. So the brain's connecting up lots of different distal parts so that they can talk to each other and work as a whole. And there's lots more that I could tell you about the developing youth brain, but these are probably two of the most robust and well-recognised findings. And what they do tell us is that the brain is changing a lot. But in a sense, the really more important question here is, what does it all mean? And as you may be aware, there's been a kind of a mania for popular science books and popular science articles about the developing youth brain, and they all tend to have a pretty similar theme. They have this theme where they say, why are kids so crazy? Why do they do these stupid things? It's because their brains are immature in some way. And there's a model of it that's called the dual systems model, and it's a model that says, so what we've got is we've got this emotional part of the brain, which is a bit of a problem. And then we've got this other part of the brain that kind of controls it, and that's good. And what's wrong with young people, they've got too much of this emotion and they haven't got enough of this control, and that's why they do these crazy things. Now, I've been fairly, as you can tell, I'm not a big fan of that particular way of thinking about it, and I've written articles criticising it from a scientific point of view. But I think the other thing is, from a cultural point of view, it's very important to notice how we're slipping into a certain set of stories that we like to tell about young people and adolescents, and we're using neuroscience to kind of back it up and make it sound very scientific. But in fact, there's lots of different ways you can think about this. In fact, I've fallen afoul of this myself. There's a little article that came out in an Iranian website a long time ago. And as you can see, this starts off with, angst-ridden teens really do have something wrong with their heads, Australian researchers said on Monday. And if I read that, I would think, what a fool, who possibly said that? Well, of course, it was me. I was the idiot who said that. To in my own defence, I'll say that's not exactly what I said. It wasn't even close to what I said, but that's what the journalist wanted to say. And so they put this story out there. But you see, the thing is, it's just possible that there's actually nothing wrong with the teenage brain. It's actually well designed for exactly what it should be doing. Think about what people are doing developmentally during adolescence. They're changing from people who are dependent to people who are independent. Now, how do you get there? You have to learn. And learning involves experimentation, failure, trying new things, taking risks, playing around, in this case, with identity, with sexuality, with long-term values, with things like this. And this is exactly what a young person should be doing. In fact, I sometimes say to parents, when I'm working clinically, I say, listen, what kind of kid do you think there would be at a 20-year-old if all they had done their whole life is exactly what their parents have told them to do? And you can see the conflict in the parent's brain when you say that, because they really would like their kids just to do what they were told to do, but they can also see the logic in it that they've got to do some things for themselves and try things out and so forth. And so it's in fact may be that the teenage brain, which encourages experimentation and risk-taking and exploration and all these sorts of things and connecting with peers and so forth, is in fact very well designed for exactly the kinds of developmental tasks that a young person is facing. So I think that this kind of storytelling is very important, and we need to think very carefully about how we characterise things. Another thing about the teenage brain is that we often try to talk about mental health problems in terms of the teenage brain being immature. But as you can see in this cartoon here, this is Dilbert. He says, "I'm worried because I don't seem to have any problems today." His friend said, "Uh-oh," he said, "it either means I'm insane or the universe is saving up something big for me. I feel like a nail waiting to get hammered." And his friend said, "I think the prefrontal cortex is overrated." And the point behind this joke is that in fact, some of the mental health problems that people start to experience during adolescence may in fact not be a sign of an immature brain, but they may be a sign of a maturing brain. That as they're entering into this adult world of complexities and responsibilities, they're now starting to deal with adult-like problems. And that's part of the burden of getting older at this particular age. Now, I'm going to move on to the third question. Is it any use? Is it clinically useful? I want to start with this comment. It's quite a devastating one, I think. This is from Tom Insel, who was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States for a long time. I'll read it out to you. "I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders, and when I look back on that, I realised that while I think we succeeded in getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalisations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that." That was an interview he gave to the Atlantic magazine earlier this year. It's a pretty devastating self-assessment, isn't it? So I think in some ways he may be being a little bit hard on himself, maybe he's having sort of a crisis of sorts, but it's a challenging assessment, and it's one that we really need to deal with. And I think that the question of whether brain science and developmental brain science is any use really depends on what you want from it, what you were expecting. So one way of thinking about this, I think, is to break down the different parts of the human experience in this fairly simple way. We can think about their neurobiology, the environment in which people live, their thoughts, feelings and behaviours, so their psychological aspects. And then, of course, if we're interested in mental health, we're also interested in symptoms or difficulties that people might be having related to mental health. Now, Tom Insel is a card-carrying biological psychiatrist, and so he has this view of the world. What we want to do is we've got this neurobiological problem, it's related to the symptoms, and so what we want to do is we want to treat that and we fix the symptoms. And I think if that's what you're looking for from brain science, then I think Insel's judgment is probably pretty fair. We haven't produced a lot of new treatments recently, specifically ones that are based on research. And in fact, most of the treatments that have been discovered that are biological, like medications and so forth, were actually the result of serendipity. Accidental discoveries that certain classes of medicines had benefits for people with mental health problems, and then we had to kind of reverse engineer it and work out why. So it hasn't come out of research. There's a second view of this, which is what I call the basic science fundamentalist model, and this is the person who says, well, we don't know where all this is heading, we just need to study the brain and understand it deeply and understand the mechanisms, and if we do that, then one day something will be transformative, something will come of that. It's a little bit like how quantum physics resulted in Wi-Fi. You know, the quantum physicists didn't know that they were working on Wi-Fi, but now we've got Wi-Fi, and that's part of the benefit. And this is, you know, I think this is a fair point. And, you know, basic science does have a track record in this regard. But, you know, the thing is it's slow. And so while this might be one track that we want to pursue, we're probably, in my humble opinion, investing too much into it compared to perhaps the track which is going to help people in a more proximal way. Now, there's also another way of thinking about this that I think is interesting, and this is what I call the public policy priority model. And this is where if you show something with neuroscience, then people think it's more important than if you didn't show it with neuroscience. So, for example, there's no more well-established finding in social science than poverty is bad for kids. Right? It's unequivocal. We've got bucket loads of evidence on it. But then when someone comes out and shows that poverty is bad for kids' brains, suddenly it's on the front of the newspaper and all the policymakers are going, oh my goodness, we better do something about this. Now, you know, it's kind of a pity that they didn't want to do something about it before, but you know, if it gets you there, all well and good. So I think neuroscience can be useful also in this kind of polemical way. But finally I want to say, and you've probably got to this point yourself by now, this is how it really works, right? It's not convenient for us scientists. We want things to sit still and be easy to, you know, quantify and so forth. But this is the reality. Everything's influencing everything else. This is why the brain is so complex, because it's an information processing device par excellence. It's always processing information and producing new behaviour and influencing the environment and so forth, blah, blah, blah. And so it's all whirring around constantly. And so what this really means is that if we're thinking about neurobiology as one aspect of this, we can actually intervene here, or we can intervene here, or we can intervene here. And we're doing neurobiology all the time. So in other words, the point here is that neurobiological data is not special. It's not different. It's not more powerful than other kinds of data. It's one aspect of data that we can have on how human beings are functioning. And in fact, when we change people's behaviour, like if we change their sleep, which is something we've been looking at, or if we change people's environments by changing parenting, which is another thing that we've been looking at, we're actually doing neurobiology. And in fact, we've also done, in some of our research, we've done the work to show that sleep does affect brain development and brain development affects sleep, parenting affects brain development and so on and so forth. So this is really a more realistic view of the system. And I think we've got to think about it this way if we want to see how it can actually be useful. All right, so now I'm going to finish with my 10 commandments. When I first wrote them, I had 7, but I pushed a little further just to get to 10. So I hope they're all worth it. There might be a couple of weak ones in there. I wonder if that's how it worked with the Bible, you know? God got to 6 and he was like, yeah, I'd rather have 10, you know, I'll just squeeze a few more out, you know. Maybe that one about obeying your parents or something, I don't know. Anyway, all right. So the first thing is always, when you're doing neuroscientific research, always have multi-level assessment. Never just measure the brain. Measure behaviour, measure the environment. Do these things as well, because you're not going to have the whole picture if you don't do that. Secondly, use a developmental lens. Think about what is the brain of this person meant to do at this stage of their life? What is the sensitivity that they're wanting to learn about at this stage of their life? What is the task that they're trying to get to? Thirdly, think about what's modifiable here. If you're studying something that's not modifiable, then you better add something in that is modifiable that interacts with it or something like that, because it's no good saying, well, we found a bump in the head and that's related to something, but there's nothing we can do about it. So always think about what's modifiable. If you think it's going to be useful for assessment, then ask the question, is it scalable? Can I actually get it out to people in a useful way or not? As I said before, look out for serendipity. That's actually the thing that's got the best track record. All right? Accidental discoveries, not this hypothetical, deductive sort of thing where we do our science one step at a time. The thing that's really produced the transformative findings is accidents. So never forget about the accidents. Always measure the ecologically valid outcomes. If you're interested in risk-taking, measure risk-taking in the real world, not just in the lab. If you're interested in mental health, measure mental health. Always measure the thing that you're ultimately interested in. Be sceptical of small studies. We've got a lot of big problem in neuroscience with small studies, and a lot of them have been very unreliable. Now, we're moving beyond that now, but you've got to be really sceptical of them. Humans are not rats, well, at least some of them aren't. And so, although animal neuroscience is very useful in determining some of the mechanisms involved, there are certain key aspects of the human experience that we simply can't study in animal models, particularly our social world and our social relationships, and we know how important they are. Ask yourself, is the neuroscience adding anything? Don't just biologise what we know anyway. A little bit like the poverty story. And then finally, if you're going to use neuroscience findings in the public sphere, use them to increase public understanding and reduce stigma, not just to re-emphasise prejudices and stereotypes. Thank you very much for listening.